A storm can take thousands of lives. We've seen that happen before. But what if most of those people didn't die because the storm was unstoppable? What if they died because the warning never reached them? On a single night in November 1970, more than 500,000 people were gone in just a few hours. The part that still stays with me isn't how powerful the cyclone was. It's the fact that the world had already been watching it for 4 days. Satellites tracked it. Weather experts knew where it was going. Warnings were issued. Government officials knew exactly what was coming. But out on those small islands, families finished dinner, put their kids to bed, and went to sleep like it was any other night. They had no idea a wall of seawater was already moving toward them. This isn't just a story about one of the deadliest storms in history. It's a story about what happens when the last step in a warning system fails. One decision, one broken link. And the consequences were so devastating that they didn't just change millions of lives, they helped change the future of an entire nation. When people talk about the world's deadliest natural disasters, hurricanes and cyclones usually come up. But one storm stands above all the others, and surprisingly, most people have never even heard of it. It was called the Bola cyclone, and it struck on the night of the 12th of November, 1970. By the time it was over, somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people had lost their lives. No tropical cyclone in recorded history has ever come close to that level of destruction. It wasn't just another powerful storm. It became one of the greatest human tragedies ever caused by weather. To understand why, you have to look at where it happened. The Bay of Bengal isn't like most coastlines. It's shaped almost like a giant funnel. As a cyclone moves north, the water has less and less space to spread out. Instead, it gets pushed forward and forced higher. That turns an already dangerous storm into something far more deadly. The coastline itself makes things even worse. The sea becomes much shallower near the delta, so the incoming water has nowhere to go except inland. Every mile the storm moves closer to shore, the storm surge grows taller and stronger. Then there are the islands. Places like Bola, Manpura, Hatia, and Tazumuddin weren't rocky islands sitting high above the ocean. They were made from river sediment, rebuilt year after year by floods. Most of the land stood only a few feet above sea level. In many places, the ground wasn't much higher than an average person's height. Still, millions of people called these islands home. Families grew rice there. Fishermen made a living from the rivers and the sea. Homes were built with bamboo, mud, rope, and palm leaves because those were the materials people had. They weren't designed to survive hurricane-force winds or a massive wall of seawater. Most people had never needed anything stronger. Life there had always been tied to the water. The rivers brought food, fertile soil, and work. But they also brought danger. Everyone knew storms could happen. Few could imagine one this powerful. That combination of funnel-shaped bay, shallow coastal waters, and millions of people living on land barely above sea level created one of the most vulnerable places on Earth. Once a major cyclone entered the Bay of Bengal, the odds were already stacked against everyone living there. Long before the first wave reached the shore, the disaster had already been set in motion. The geography alone had turned a powerful storm into something far more devastating. And sadly, the people living on those islands had almost no way to escape what was coming. Here's the part that completely changed the way I looked at this disaster. The Bola cyclone didn't appear out of nowhere. It actually gave people several days of warning. Everything started on the 8th of November, 1970, when a low-pressure system formed over the warm waters of the Bay of Bengal. At first, it didn't look unusual. Storms developed there all the time. But the ocean was still holding a huge amount of heat from the summer months. That warm water became fuel, and the system grew fast. Within a couple of days, it had turned into a powerful tropical cyclone. What makes this story so frustrating is that the storm wasn't hidden. In fact, it was being watched from space. The ITOS, one weather satellite, launched by the United States less than a year earlier, captured images of the storm almost as soon as it began forming. Day after day, meteorologists tracked its movement. They watched it grow stronger. They watched it move steadily toward East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. The information didn't stay inside a laboratory. It was sent directly to the Pakistan Meteorological Department. Weather experts studied the data, confirmed the danger, and issued official forecasts. Bulletins were sent out on schedule. Ships received warnings. Coastal ports were alerted. Radio Pakistan began broadcasting emergency messages. From a technical point of view, the system was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. The satellite worked. The forecasting center worked. The communication network worked. Everything looked successful on paper. But that's exactly what makes this story so difficult to understand. If the storm was detected days in advance, if experts knew where it was going, if official warnings were sent, then why were hundreds of thousands of people still sleeping peacefully that night? Why did so many families have no idea that one of the deadliest storms in history was only hours away? That's the question that keeps coming back. The problem wasn't predicting the cyclone. The problem was getting that information to the people whose lives depended on it. A forecast only matters if someone actually hears it. A warning only works if people understand it and have enough time to act. Without that final step, even the most advanced weather technology becomes almost meaningless. And that's exactly what happened here. The storm was never invisible. It wasn't missed by scientists. It wasn't a forecasting failure. Somewhere between the weather office and the people living on those small islands, the warning simply stopped. That final connection, the one that mattered most, never reached the families standing directly in the storm's path. And that single failure would soon become one of the deadliest breakdowns in disaster warning history. This is where the story stops being about weather. The cyclone wasn't missed. The forecast wasn't wrong. The real failure happened in the last step, the step that should have saved lives. On paper, the warning system looked complete. Government offices raised cyclone warning flags. Radio stations broadcast emergency bulletins. Weather officials kept sending updates as the storm moved closer. Everything seemed to be working. But for the people living on the islands, it was almost as if none of it existed. Take the warning flags, for example. They were flown at district government offices during the day. That's where the system ended. Most villagers lived miles away. By the time darkness fell, the flags couldn't be seen anyway. And when the cyclone finally came close to 11 p.m., no one was looking at government buildings. The radio wasn't much better. Officials broadcast emergency messages across the country, but there was one huge problem. Most national broadcasts were in Urdu, the official language of Pakistan at the time. The people living across the delta mostly spoke Bengali. Even when local stations tried to broadcast in Bengali, another problem got in the way. Very few families actually owned a radio. A working battery-powered radio wasn't something every home had. Sometimes an entire village shared one. It might be kept at a tea shop, a mosque, or an elder's house. At night, it usually wasn't turned on. There was no reason to expect a special announcement. So, while officials believed they had issued a warning, most of the people in danger never heard a single word. Later studies showed just how serious that failure was. Less than 3% of the people living in the areas most at risk received a warning they could actually use. That means more than 97% went to bed without knowing. One of the deadliest storms in history was only hours away. Think about that for a second. The satellite did its job. Meteorologists did their job. The forecasts were accurate. The messages were sent. But the families standing directly in the cyclone's path were left completely unaware. That's the difference between sending a warning and delivering one. A warning isn't successful because someone writes it down or broadcasts it from a government office. It's successful only when the person in danger hears it, understands it, believes it, and has enough time to act. None of that happened here. The system didn't fail because the technology was missing. It failed because it was built around institutions instead of people. The information reached offices. It reached officials. But it never reached the front door of the families whose lives depended on it. And in the end, that broken final link became one of the biggest reasons this disaster turned into the deadliest tropical cyclone the world has ever recorded. Now imagine it's close to 11 o'clock at night. The sky is almost completely black. Thick clouds hide the moon. The rain is getting heavier. The wind has changed, and it's making a sound people have never heard before. Not thunder. Not crashing waves, just one long, deep roar coming from somewhere out at sea. At first, it doesn't seem real. Then, the ocean starts moving. This is where a lot of people picture giant waves like a tsunami. But that's not what happened. A storm surge is something very different. A tsunami usually comes as a series of powerful waves caused by an underwater earthquake. The water rushes in, then eventually pulls back. A storm surge doesn't behave that way. It's more like the entire ocean slowly rises and keeps coming. Strong winds push huge amounts of seawater toward the shore, while the storm's low pressure lifts the sea even higher. In the Bay of Bengal, that water had nowhere else to go. The coastline acted like a funnel, forcing the sea higher and farther inland. That night, the surge reached nearly 33 feet in some places. Think about that for a second. Most of the islands were only 6 to 10 feet above sea level. The water wasn't just flooding streets, it was swallowing entire communities. Within minutes, rice fields disappeared. Dirt roads vanished. Homes built from bamboo and palm leaves simply broke apart. They weren't designed to stand against hurricane-force winds, let alone a moving wall of seawater. Families had nowhere to run. There were no concrete shelters nearby, no evacuation routes, no bridges leading to higher ground. Most islands didn't even have high ground to begin with. People climbed onto roofs, some held onto palm trees. Parents lifted children above their heads, hoping to keep them out of the water just a little longer. Many were swept away anyway. What makes this even harder to imagine is that it all happened in complete darkness. There was no electricity across much of the delta. Survivors couldn't see the water. They could only hear it getting closer. Then they felt it. The seawater wasn't clean. It carried mud, broken bamboo, pieces of houses, trees, fishing boats, anything the storm had already destroyed, and it just kept pushing inland. Another detail people often miss is that the water didn't leave right away. A tsunami may last only a few minutes before it begins to retreat. This storm surge stayed. For hours, villages remained under deep, fast-moving seawater. Even if someone survived the first impact, they still had to fight cold, exhaustion, debris, and powerful currents in total darkness. By the time the sun finally came up, the coastline people had known their entire lives was gone. Entire villages had simply disappeared beneath the sea. What had started as a cyclone had become something much worse night that few survivors would ever be able to put into words. When daylight finally broke on the morning of November 13, the storm had already passed. But what people saw was almost impossible to believe. Entire villages were simply gone. The rice fields had turned into muddy seawater. Roads had disappeared. Fishing boats were scattered miles from where they belonged. In many places, there wasn't even enough left to tell where a neighborhood had once stood. For the survivors, the silence was almost as frightening as the storm itself. There were no voices, no children playing, no animals. Just broken trees, wrecked homes, and water stretching across the land. Families started looking for loved ones. Parents searched for their children. Husbands searched for wives. Neighbors called out familiar names, hoping for an answer that often never came. Most never found one. The first official estimates were already shocking. Local officials initially believed around 50,000 people had died, but as more information came in, the numbers kept rising. Within days, estimates reached 300,000. Later international reports suggested the true death toll may have been close to 500,000 people. Even today, no one knows the exact number, and honestly, they never will. One reason is heartbreaking. Many victims were never recovered. The storm surge carried bodies out into rivers and the open sea. Entire families disappeared together, leaving no one behind to report who was missing. In some villages, every member of every household was gone. There was simply no one left to count. That's why many of the final estimates weren't based on recovered bodies. They came from comparing population records before and after the disaster. Officials looked at census data and counted how many people had simply vanished. Imagine a tragedy so large that the only way to measure it is by counting the people who never came home. Rescue efforts were almost non-existent during those first critical days. Roads had been washed away, communication had collapsed, Boats were destroyed. There were very few helicopters, and almost no organized search teams reached the hardest-hit islands right away. The first people searching for survivors weren't trained rescue workers. They were the survivors themselves. Fishermen used the few boats that were still floating. Families dug through wreckage with their bare hands. Neighbors helped neighbors because there was no one else coming. Meanwhile, thousands who had survived the storm were now facing another fight. There was almost no clean drinking water. Wells had filled with salt water. Food was running out. The heat, contaminated water, and decomposing bodies created the perfect conditions for disease. For many people, surviving the cyclone was only the beginning. Looking back, it's easy to focus on the final death toll, but numbers can hide the human reality. Every missing person had a name. Every empty house had a family. And when the sun rose over Bola that morning, it wasn't just a coastline that had disappeared. An entire way of life had been swept away in a single night. You might think that after a disaster this big, the government would respond immediately, but that isn't what happened. For the people stranded across the delta, help didn't arrive when they needed it most. In fact, for the first few days, there was almost nothing. At the time, Pakistan was being led by President Yahya Khan. When the cyclone made landfall, he was on an official visit to China. He didn't return right away, and his first public response came several days after the disaster. For survivors who had just lost their families, their homes, and everything they owned, that silence was impossible to ignore. The government insisted relief efforts were underway, but the reality on the ground looked very different. East Pakistan simply wasn't prepared for a disaster of this scale. There were very few helicopters available. Most of the military was stationed more than 1,000 miles away in West Pakistan. There was no large evacuation force ready to move, no organized rescue plan for the isolated islands, and almost no way to reach communities that had been completely cut off. So the people who survived had to depend on each other. Fishermen used damaged boats to search for neighbors. Families pulled people from the water with their own hands. Villages shared whatever food and clean water they could still find. They weren't waiting for professional rescue teams. They became the rescue teams. A few days later, international aid finally began arriving. Britain sent helicopters. The United States delivered food, medicine, and emergency supplies. Other countries offered assistance as well. But even then, getting that aid to the people who needed it was painfully slow. Roads had disappeared. Ports were damaged. Entire islands were still surrounded by floodwater. In some places, survivors waited nearly a week before meaningful help reached them. By then, many people who had survived the cyclone were dying from hunger, dehydration, infections, and contaminated water. That's the part people sometimes forget. The disaster didn't end when the winds stopped. It continued because recovery came too late. And I think that's the biggest lesson here. A natural hazard becomes a true disaster only when people aren't prepared and help doesn't arrive in time. The cyclone was a force of nature, but the scale of the tragedy wasn't caused by nature alone. It was shaped by decisions, by planning that never existed, by resources that weren't where they were needed, and by a system that failed the people it was supposed to protect. In the end, the storm exposed something much bigger than extreme weather. It exposed the cost of being overlooked. And once people realized that, the conversation was no longer just about a cyclone. It had become a question of trust, responsibility, and whether a government had truly protected its own citizens. By this point, the cyclone was over. But something much bigger had begun. For many people in East Pakistan, this wasn't just about losing family members or homes anymore. It was about realizing they had been left on their own when they needed help the most. That feeling didn't disappear after the floodwaters went down. It turned into anger. And eventually, that anger became political. For years, many Bengalis already believed they were being treated differently from the people in West Pakistan. They felt ignored when it came to government spending, political power, and economic development. The cyclone didn't create those frustrations. It exposed them in the most painful way possible. People had watched hundreds of thousands die after a storm that everyone in the government already knew was coming. That was something they couldn't forget. Just a few weeks later, Pakistan held its first national election. For many survivors, Voting wasn't simply about choosing politicians anymore. It became their chance to demand change. The result was overwhelming. The Awami League, led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, won 160 out of 162 seats in East Pakistan. It wasn't even close. The party earned a clear majority in the National Assembly and, under a normal parliamentary system, should have formed the next government. The people had spoken. Their decision couldn't have been much clearer, but that wasn't what happened. Instead of transferring power, the military government delayed the opening of the National Assembly. Negotiations dragged on. Political leaders argued. Weeks passed with no resolution. For millions of Bengalis, it felt like their votes no longer mattered. First, they believed their lives had been treated as unimportant during the cyclone. Now, they felt their voices were being ignored after the election. That combination shattered what little trust remained. Protests spread across East Pakistan. Businesses closed. Government offices stopped functioning. Civil servants began following local political leaders instead of orders from Islamabad. The relationship between the eastern and western parts of the country was falling apart in front of everyone's eyes. Looking back, it's clear the cyclone didn't cause all of this by itself. The political tensions had existed for years. But the disaster became the moment everything changed. It forced millions of people to ask a simple question. If a government can't protect its citizens during their darkest hour and then refuses to respect their vote, what reason do those citizens have to keep believing in that government? Once that question took hold, there was no easy way back. The cyclone had started as a natural disaster. By the end of the year, it had become a political turning point that would reshape the future of the entire region. By early 1971, the political crisis had reached a breaking point. What started as frustration after the cyclone had turned into nationwide resistance. Across East Pakistan, people walked off their jobs, businesses closed, schools shut down. Government offices stopped working. Massive strikes spread from city streets to small towns. For many Bengalis, this wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a demand to be heard. The election had already shown what the people wanted. They had voted clearly and overwhelmingly. But when that result was pushed aside, many felt they had run out of peaceful options. The tension kept building. Then, on the night of the 25th of March, 1971, everything changed. The Pakistani military launched Operation Searchlight. Its goal was simple: crush the growing movement in East Pakistan before it could grow any stronger. Troops moved into Dhaka and other major cities. Universities were attacked. Political offices were raided. Community leaders were arrested. Many civilians were caught in the violence. Instead of ending the resistance, the operation had the opposite effect. It convinced millions of people that there was no path forward inside a united Pakistan. Within days, what had been a political crisis became an armed conflict. The Bangladesh Liberation War had begun. For the next 9 months, fighting spread across the region. Entire communities were caught in the middle. Millions of people fled across the border into India, creating one of the largest refugee crises of its time. The human cost was enormous. Even today, historians continue to debate the exact number of people who died. But everyone agrees that the suffering was on a massive scale. In December 1971, Indian forces entered the war in support of Bangladesh. The conflict came to a rapid end. On the 16th of December, 1971, Pakistani forces in East Pakistan surrendered. A new country was born. Bangladesh became an independent nation. Looking back, it's easy to say the war was caused by politics, and that's true. The tensions had existed for years. There were disagreements over language, economic inequality, political representation, and military power long before the cyclone arrived. But the Bola cyclone became the moment those problems could no longer be ignored. It showed millions of people what happened when a government failed to protect them during their darkest hour. Then, only weeks later, many of those same people watched their democratic vote be set aside. That combination changed everything. So, in the end, the Bola cyclone wasn't just the deadliest tropical cyclone in recorded history. It became the spark that exposed years of broken trust. One night of wind and water didn't destroy a country by itself. But it revealed deep cracks that had been growing for decades, and once those cracks finally opened, an entire nation came apart, making way for the birth of another. The story doesn't end with the cyclone. In many ways, that's where the real change began. After Bangladesh became independent, the country made one promise: it would never let a disaster like Ebola happen the same way again. Thousands of cyclone shelters were built across the coastal region. A nationwide warning system was created. Tens of thousands of trained volunteers now go door to door when a major storm is coming, making sure people don't just hear the warning, they understand it and have time to leave. The results speak for themselves. When Cyclone Sidr struck in 2007, it was similar in strength to Ebola, but the number of lives lost was dramatically lower. That wasn't because the storm was weaker, it was because the country was better prepared. I think that's the biggest lesson this story leaves behind. Nature can be incredibly powerful. We may never be able to stop a cyclone from forming, but we can decide how ready we are before it arrives. In the end, the number of lives lost isn't determined by the storm alone. It's determined by whether the warning reaches the people who need it most and whether someone is ready to act before it's too late. That may be the most important legacy the Ebola cyclone left for Bangladesh and for the rest of the world.